So, let's say we now have a government that's trying to deal with a large current account deficit. How can it do that? Well, remember, current account deficits can be caused from a whole host of various factors. So the government needs to first pinpoint the cause of the deficit before it actually knows how to solve the deficit. So let's say the reason for a current account deficit was because there was high demand in the domestic economy, incomes were very high as a result in the domestic economy, and there was a very high demand for imports. Well, if that was the reason why there's a deficit, then maybe the government should try and reduce the level of aggregate demand in the economy, which will reduce the spending on imports. It can do that by imposing contractionary monetary or fiscal policies. So for contractionary fiscal policy, it might want to reduce government spending or increase taxation. Monetary policy, maybe increase interest rates or reduce the money supply, all of which will reduce aggregate demand and therefore reduce the level of import spending in the economy. But the problem with that, anytime we reduce AD, there are big side effects, big problems, in that growth is going to reduce and unemployment is going to increase. Terrible side effects. You're making what many governments would argue more important macroeconomic objectives worse. Is that really a good trade-off? Probably not. Also, whether these policies will work or not depends on a standard. Demand-side policy depends on points. So the level of consumer confidence, the initial level of economic activity, the size of the multiplier, whether it's been offset by other factors, etc. By the way, if you want to understand why current account deficits might be caused, watch my previous video on causes of a current account deficit to understand. Let's say that import prices were too low. That's why we were demanding so many imports. Or let's say export prices were too high, in which case the government can actually get in and protect domestic industries. It can artificially raise the price of imports and artificially lower the price of exports by imposing protectionist measures, such as tariffs and quotas, which will raise, or tariffs will raise the price of imports because it's a tax on import. Quotas will restrict the level of imports allowed into the country. There are other protectionist measures as well which can restrict imports. At the same time, they might want to provide subsidies to domestic firms, which lowers their cost of production. It makes exports more competitive, potentially then increasing the level of exports being sold. So these are ways in which a current account deficit can be rectified. But there are some major issues with this idea as well. Retaliation, first of all. If one government decides to protect its domestic industries, chances are other governments won't like it. Other governments are going to retaliate and say, hang on a minute, if you're protecting your stuff against us and you're imposing taxes on our products, then we're going to impose taxes on your products. Chances are you're going to see retaliation, which is a big negative, reducing overall trade in the economy. At the same time, if you make imports more expensive by imposing tariffs, firms who rely on imports to make goods and services, well, their cost of production is going to increase, which therefore may lead to increased prices and inflation. So there is a chance of imports and inflation for firms who actually import raw materials if you artificially increase the price of imports. At the same time, by providing subsidies to domestic producers, or just generally, by reducing the level of imports into the economy, you're reducing competition for domestic firms. So domestic firms might become lazy. They might not actually need to reduce their prices and keep their prices high. That's another problem there. So number one, number two, not the greatest policies because of the massive negative side effects. What about if a strong currency was the reason why there was a current account deficit? In which case the government should look to weaken the currency. Maybe tell the central bank or somehow allow the central bank to reduce interest rates. Or maybe they can meddle in the foreign exchange markets and sell the currency, causing it to decrease, increasing supply. That will allow WIDEC to work. Remember, WIDEC means with a weak currency, imports become more expensive and exports become cheaper. So the demand for exports will rise, the demand for imports will fall, potentially increasing net exports and reducing the current account deficit. But whether that works or not depends on the PED for imports and exports, as explained on my previous video. It also might lead to import and inflation as imports become more expensive, which is quite a big negative side effect and can again conflict with the inflation objective of government. So then, if that's a slightly dubious policy as well, maybe the best idea is to implement supply-side policies. Any supply-side policies which increase the productive capacity of the economy, thus putting downward pressure on prices, reducing cost-push inflationary pressures. And in doing so, exports may become more competitive, which then may increase the demand for exports, and then again reduce the current account deficit problems that a country might be experiencing. But the problems with supply-side policies are, as we know, they're very expensive, they carry a large opportunity cost, They take a long time to work, there is no guarantee that they will work, and for these policies to reduce inflation, to increase the productive capacity, depends initially on the level of economic activity as well. So, these are all the policies available to government. Whatever policy needs to be used depends on the cause, but you might argue regardless that supply-side policies are the best policies. But you can evaluate it in another way. You could actually say, well, hang on a minute. It looks like a current account deficit or trade problems are not so much of an issue for governments. Growth, unemployment and inflation are potentially more important macroeconomic objectives. So if a country's got a current account deficit, but only a very small deficit, then you could argue the government doesn't really need to get involved. All these policies, yeah, they're available, but do they really need to worry about such a small current account deficit as a percentage of GDP? So for example, the UK has had such a small current account deficit, around between 2 and 5% of GDP over the last 20 years. That's not really that big a deal. So that's another very good way to argue. Yes, it depends on the cause of the deficit for the government to actually know how to solve it. But you could argue that maybe the government doesn't need to solve it, especially given the massive side effects of the policies that it could use and the conflicts with other objectives at the same time. So maybe a current account deficit can be allowed to occur if it's a very, very small percentage of GDP. That's policies to improve current account deficit and evaluation. Thanks for watching. See you next time.